So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining for today's book talk, From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia, co-authored by Dan Slater and Joseph Wong. My name is Gautam Nair. I am an assistant professor at the Kennedy School. Before I introduce Professor Slater, I just want to share a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. The Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as a traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Today's event is being recorded, and the video may be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel. So we'll be reserving time for questions in the second half of the hour. Um, at that time, you can raise your hand if you have a question, and a staff member will be around to pass a microphone. So I'd like to thank Melissa Dinello, Daniel Wireman, Dan Harsha, and others at the Art Center for putting together this event. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our featured speaker for today's discussion. So Dan Slater is the James Orrin Murfin Professor of Political Science, the Ronald and Eileen Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies, and Director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. He came to Michigan in 2017 after 12 years on the faculty at the University of Chicago, where he served as director for the Center for International Social Science Research, CISSR, associate professor in the Department of Political Science, and associate member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Slater is one of the world's preeminent scholars of comparative politics and the political economy of development. He's the author of several books, including Ordering Power, Contentious Politics, and Authoritarian Leviathans in Southeast Asia, and numerous articles in leading journals such as the American Journal of Political Science and the American Journal of Sociology. His work is centrally concerned with the politics of enduring dictatorships and emerging democracies. Democracies, to channel Tolstoy for a moment, are all happily alike in a way, but dictatorships vary widely in how they wield and share power. Over the past couple of decades, we have learned a tremendous amount in terms of how authoritarian regimes function, endure, and die. And Professor Slater has been at the forefront of this research effort. His research is now essential reading for scholars of Asia and Southeast Asia. And thanks to his work, these populous and economically dynamic regions occupy a much more central place in research and political science than they used to. He's also played an important role in revitalizing and sustaining the place of comparative historical methods and deep theoretically informed qualitative analyses of country cases in our discipline. Running through his work is a concern with the question of when and why elites decide to build powerful and capable states and political parties, and how these organizations in turn shape development trajectories. In much of East and Southeast Asia, economic development has come about in the absence of democracy, but in the presence of effective states and strong parties. This fact is an obvious tension with Professor Slater's deep personal commitment to liberal democracy, and perhaps his new book can be read as an effort to understand how we might get more of both development and democracy. Finally, Dan is well known throughout the discipline as a perceptive, kind, and generous mentor and collaborator to scores of graduate students, junior faculty, and senior scholars. I myself learned a lot of what I know from his rigorous seminars on authoritarian regimes and comparative politics. My students complain about too much reading, and that's only because they haven't been to one of Dan's classes. But it tells you something that I was still inspired by his example to become a political scientist and comparativist. So it is a real honor and privilege to have him here today. So I'm going to give the floor to Dan, who will give remarks for about 25 or 30 minutes before we dig into questions from the audience. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Slater. And this is the book.
Most important is fun. Well, Colin, thank you so much for that. That was a very, very sweet introduction. Thanks, Parth, for having me on. Thanks, everybody. Is this okay? So, and for everyone here at the Kennedy School for having me out, for coming. I'm told there's a slam poetry session happening next door. So if you're in the wrong place, we've got time to go. If maybe
they're in the wrong place.
They're in the wrong place. There may be people. Everybody's in the wrong place. If my cadence suddenly changes and shifts in odd poetic directions, you'll know why. We're trying to raise the standard of our neighbors. Yeah, so the idea here today is to come and talk about this ebook that Joe Wong and I published in September with Princeton University Press, and you can kind of see the title here. And this book was a long time in coming. It took us a long time to complete it, but I think in some ways the delays in completing the book served some useful purposes. That a lot of interesting dynamics have unfolded in the last 3 or 4 years that I think our book could shed some interesting light on. And if we had published the book, when we promised Princeton we would publish the book, which was a good 5 or 6 years ago, some of these things wouldn't come to pass. We think about some of the dramatic events in Myanmar with the coup. If we think about Hong Kong's descent from being this very kind of governable, peaceful, wealthy city to almost an ungovernable city during the protests of 2019. If we think about Malaysia, it's a place where it's very stable for a very long time, authoritarian regime, and now this kind of old authoritarian ruling arrangement is kind of come unglued. There's a lot of dynamism in the region, and I think globally, we're really kind of in a moment, and we've coming up a decade of a lot of democratic pessimism. And I think that what our book will hopefully do is provide some sense of democratic possibility, and maybe in a part of the world where democratic possibility is seen as low rather than high. So let me kind of dig into the book, and I'm going to sort of overview the book in a relatively broad brush way. I don't want to give you too much of the detail because it could bore you, maybe not buy the book because you already know everything. And want to save more time for the Q&A. So I'm going to go real deep into the 12 cases in the book. That's hard to do in 25 minutes anyway. But during the Q&A and afterwards, really happy to talk about all the cases we talk about in the book, because it is very much a book about a part of the world, about a region. So just to kind of give a quick overview. So the setting for the book is what we call developmental Asia. This is 12 cases that link Northeast and Southeast Asia, and we divide them into 4 distinct clusters. I think for those of you who are interested in Asian political economy, Asian cultures, Asian anything, I think the way that we try to arrange Asian space and try to rethink Asian geography is, I hope, one of the big contributions here, at least a thought-provoking move that we make, to talk about 4 different clusters of cases. So rather than it being Northeast Asia versus Southeast Asia, as you'll see, I'll talk about these clusters momentarily. The puzzle of the book is that this region, of course, has experienced a great deal of economic development, but much less democratization. And if you are inclined to believe quantitative analyses about the world, you'll know that the correlation between economic development and democracy is basically an unbreakable correlation, no matter how you run a regression. It is very clearly a relationship. We know, I think we all know, that although they're correlated, that economic development does not always lead to democracy. Our title is not meant to imply that it always does. But we are interested in this trajectory from and why basically about half of the countries we look at in Asia have in fact moved from development to democracy. Some have also reversed, whereas half have not. Okay, so the approach we take, we try to examine developmental Asia's uneven and, as I said, clustered democratization experience from a historical perspective. All the work that I do and that Joe does, we really try to bring a historical perspective to politics. And the main argument that we're making is that in developmental Asia, the primary mode of democratization has been what we call democracy through strength. And in fact, up until the very last minute, for the dozen or so years we were working on this book, the title was always Democracy Through Strength, until the press said, no, it's not, you need to change the title. And so that was all done in the last minute. So beware, if you're writing a book, if you think you know the title, you might not know the title until the press tells you. So let me kind of start off with a vignette that hopefully kind of motivates the kind of variation that we're interested in here. Okay, so basically democracy can arise because the authoritarian regime is weak, or we argue because it is strong. And basically what Joe and I argue is that our theories in comparative politics overwhelmingly expect and explain democracy to arise through weakness. And we're trying to say it sometimes arises through authoritarian strength, and we want to kind of try to balance the scales by giving more attention to the part of the story that's gotten less attention. So what we're looking at here are 2 images of oaths of office being taken by newly sworn in presidents in the Philippines and in South Korea. On the Philippines, very small, you see Corazon Aquino is raising her hand. It's all over Marcos Feliz. This is February 1986. It's in the wake of the People Power movement that toppled Ferdinand Marcos, sends him into exile and into disgrace. And Aquino, his main bête noire and opponent, becomes president. Okay, the regime has collapsed. The Marcos regime is no more. Right? Although now it's arguably better. So that's for Q&A. But on the right, we have almost exactly 2 years later, we see another oath of office. No Tae here in South Korea. He's also taken the oath of office. And if this picture had been taken not much earlier, he would have been wearing a military uniform rather than this very nice business suit. Okay. And in South Korea, what happened was the regime was not toppled. The regime did not collapse, but rather the authoritarian elites, both in the ruling party and in the military, conceded democratic reforms, but did not concede defeat. They basically leveled the playing field, opened up the process, and then managed to win competitive democratic elections. Okay, so the regime democratized at a time when the authoritarian regime was strong, not when it was weak. And now, as a matter of sort of normativity and as a temperament, our initial reaction might be to say, well, on the left, like that's democratization. You got in the streets, you toppled the regime, you got rid of the old guard, you bring in home forces, that's democratization. On the right, what is that? It's just continuity. It's just, it's old wine in new bottles. This is not real change. But I think if we look, we fast forward, what are we now? 35 or so years after this, I don't think anyone would look at the Philippines and South Korea and say that democracy in the Philippines is going a whole lot better than in South Korea. So we really want to stress the point from this example on the right. It's cases like this that motivate the book, that what arises from democracy through strength, at least in this region we're looking at, is in fact real democracy. Okay, obviously not perfect, no democracy is, but these are not just sort of diminished subtypes. These are true democracies. And the three main cases we look at, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, I think are three of the most stable, robust, high quality democracies in the world. So even as we see democratic backsliding and erosion, on both sides of the Atlantic, and a lot of democracies that were presumed to be very mature, very consolidated, very steady, that in East Asia, we're seeing a lot of democratic stability, which I think is worth trying to explain better. Because very, very rarely, and only in a very light way, do these kind of cases actually feature in our theories of democratization. Okay, so basically, the Philippines, democracy through weakness, that's a different book. Our book does not look at cases like this. We're interested in cases like what you're going to see on the right. Okay, so just to give you a sense, again, overview of the book, table of contents, we open up democracy through strength. This is the theory, which I'll be getting into. The second chapter tries to explain what we mean by developmental Asia as a world region. And then what we do a chapter each on these three very strong Northeast Asian cases of democratic development, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And then we do actually 2 chapters on China. We do 1 chapter on China up until 1989. And then we do another one that looks at China in the reform era and in the Xi Jinping era, which I think is arguably not the reform era anymore. But what we sort of do here, just to give you a sense, is we lay out the case in chapters 3, 4, and 5 that when Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea became democracies, it was in the wake of substantial institution building, economic development, and the like, such that civilian conservatives in the bureaucracy and in political parties were actually quite ready to compete under democratic conditions and had a lot of confidence that democracy would not destabilize the situation. So whereas most people juxtapose China 1989 with other cases in the communist bloc, and the argument is China was extremely strong, the CCP was too strong to collapse. Why did the CCP survive while communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed? So we kind of turn this question around and say, well, what if we compare China to these developmental states in Northeast Asia, to its actual neighbors? And what we argue is, we're not arguing that the perspective that the CCP was too strong to collapse is wrong, but it's also true that it was too weak to concede. That in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square protests, the CCP simply did not have confidence that if it conceded democratic reforms, that it could continue to thrive and actually do well under democratic conditions, like its neighbors in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So it's kind of a rereading of the Chinese case in that respect. What we then do is we go and look at the other 3 main clusters. So again, to foreshadow, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea is what we call the developmental status cluster. Then we look at what we call developmental militarist, developmental Britannia, and developmental socialist clusters. And basically what we do in those sections, the militarist cluster, these are cases that all did undergo democratic experiments at times of relative regime confidence that it would go well. These have been much rockier, much more reversible democratic experiments than what we've seen in Northeast Asia. So we're talking Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar here. The developmental Britannia cluster here, all of which are cases that have avoided these kinds of democratic experiments, looking at Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. And then the developmental socialist cluster, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, where, like the development Britannia cluster, again, these are cases that even as they become substantially wealthier, especially China, they have not moved toward democratic. And in the concluding chapter, we sort of revisit some kind of big questions about democracy's kind of meaning. And we argue that democracy is, in fact, not a Western value, it's a universal value, but because it's not the ultimate value, it's always vulnerable, whether you're East or West, when democracy does not provide people's more fundamental interests in questions of peace and prosperity. So that's kind of a broad overview of what we do in the book. So let me just dive a little bit into some of the working parts, both on the theory and then on the setting as well. So by developmental Asia, we're referring to Northeast and Southeast Asian polities that have followed a state-sponsored, export-led strategy of rapid economic growth and catch-up. But they've done so with widely varying degrees of commitment and success. And in fact, a lot of the work that Joe and I have done to date is actually explaining and exploring that variation. So by no means are we sort of equating, Japan with Myanmar as sort of developmental success stories, right? But the idea is they're all in this part of this real kind of hothouse region, just really driven by, in some ways, originally by the Meiji Restoration, this rise of a developmental mindset and approach to the international economy, which involves a lot of state intervention, but also a lot of reliance on markets, and really toward this purpose of a really sustained and serious national purpose of trying to catch up with the first world, if you will, right? So the region, as we define it, is determined politically, not just geographically. Okay, so merely being, it matters that you're along the Pacific Rim of Asia. It's where all of these cases are, but there are a lot of cases in that part of the world that have simply not kind of pursued this set of policies and built the kind of institutions that we see underpinning these developmental states. So the Philippines, North Korea, Laos, Brunei, Mongolia, if these are places you're interested in, we're interested too, but they're not part of development, right? And that's a matter of, again, of political, economic choice. Actually, a question we've been being asked a lot recently, well, why not India, right? Well, India, I think if you want to think about it, you can just look at the title of the book. India is an example of trying to go from democracy to development. These are all places that have tried to pursue rapid economic development before confronting questions of democratization. Okay, India is, of course, a very, very different situation. And India also is just simply not part of this kind of Japan-led Asia-Pacific economy, kind of investment-driven, trade-driven. So although there are elements in India trying to make India a developmental state, it's doing so in I think, a very different context. Okay. This is a zone, we emphasize, it's developmental Asian zone, of shifting and overlapping American, British, Japanese, and Chinese regime influence. So one of the biggest correctives I hope we offer here is I think people tend to look at Asia now and say, well, Asia means China. Basically, Asia means authoritarianism because China is authoritarian and China has all this influence around the region. And we really try to make the point here that China is not a leader in developmental Asia. China is a latecomer to developmental Asia. And China has begun sort of pursuing the kinds of policies that countries like, again, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, even Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia have been following for decades. Okay. And so China is really trying to sort of catch up in the region as well. And so the way these four clusters were formed has a lot to do with their geopolitical influences. And so the fact that, again, you have this, it's in a way, the whole region is defined by this Japanese economic model and different variants of trying to mimic and learn from it. But because of British colonialism, because of American influence, because of certainly Chinese influence in the socialist cluster, we have this clustering effect of very different kinds of political economies. So this is what that gives us. Then this region with four identifiable clusters of distinctive types of developmentalism, profoundly shaping regime variation. Okay, and so when we think about this, it's kind of a categorical error, I think, when people think in terms of modernization theory, and they say, well, levels of development should predict regime type. Okay, they're using a level to explain a type, but it makes more sense, I think, say, well, maybe types of development should give us some leverage on explaining regime type. So that's kind of where we're going in this book, to say how does type of development rather than level of development help explain regime type. I'm sure the poetry's fantastic. So again, these four clusters, stadiums here color coded for your convenience. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, development of socialism, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, development of Britannia, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and development of militarism, Thailand, and Myanmar. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a sense of the region, the scope, the terrain, and I think there's always a trade-off in political science between writing kind of a global theoretical book and writing an area book. And we were really very committed in this book to write a book about Asia. So although I think the kind of things we're talking about here, as I get into theory, we'll see, you might see resonance with other parts of the world. I do think there's something different about this region. There's something distinctive about the region that makes it worth writing this book about the region itself. Okay, so let me try to talk it through then theoretically. Okay, so what exactly do I mean when I say these two kind of different ideal type ways to become a democracy? Through weakness versus through strength. And to reiterate, what we have on the left side, democracy through weakness, is basically democratization theory in political science. There's really, we don't have a sense as much of the way it happens on the right side of the scale. So again, trying to balance things out. So when democracy arises through weakness, that primarily means institutional weakness. So the political parties are weak, the military is fragmented, the regime is personalized, everything's factionalized, and all these internal debilities within the regime. And here's where it started. And because this regime is weak, rulers are deeply divided. So here's how democracy is going to start. The authoritarian regime is deeply divided from within. Okay. So O'Donnell and Schmitter had this famous line from one of their books from the late 80s, early 90s, when they said there's basically no regime transition that doesn't begin with some kind of major split within the ruling elites. Okay, and we're arguing that's actually not true. The ones we look at are not examples where they're predicated by and sort of driven by these divides within the ruling. Okay, so the rulers, so this classic story, the rulers are elite. Excuse me, the rulers are divided. And so then it's only as a last resort. So they're hanging on by the fingernails, and it's only when things are just got totally out of hand, they can no longer hold on, that they end up permitting democratization. Again, remember the Marcos example here, right? I'm just talk this through. What you generally see is happening is a negotiated exit. So the idea is there's some kind of roundtable agreement. The regime sits down with its opponents. There are theories of moderates and softliners, and they have to come together and say, okay, let's basically democratize and get rid of this old regime, bring in a new order. In this scenario, the old regime concedes defeat. They're done. They're out. They've lost. It's often portrayed. If you're familiar with Daniel Treisman's excellent work on this, as this is basically a matter of bungling. That what happens is authoritarian regime falls because the regime is, again, they have bad information. You're dictators, so you don't have good information, and so you make all these errors and these, this kind of keystone cop story of authoritarian regimes falling through these bubbles, right? If you're familiar with the work of Oswald and Robinson, their argument is a really influential book, and they say the only reason an authoritarian regime would accept democratic reforms is if they face an imminent threat of revolution, a violent revolutionary overthrow. Okay, our argument is going to be, you'll see, very, very different from that. When this scenario happens, your legitimacy in the regime is relinquished. Again, the regime is discredited, the old guard is thrown out, and they're sort of seen as a laughing stock. It happened very suddenly. Sort of sudden regime collapses. You turn on TV, suddenly on BBC or on CNN. Wait, all of a sudden, some capital city is completely, awash in protesters. How does this happen? And then the regime suddenly collapses. And what we get is a elite upheaval. So those who are in the regime are kicked out. Those who are outside of the regime come in, and there's this major churn. Okay, this is basically, I think, our kind of stylized notion of how democratization tends to come about, and we theorize it for you. But in all of these ways, democracy through strength is different. Okay, now in any real world example, it's going to be a mix. There will be ways in which the regime is strong, ways in which the regime is weak. But again, I think the strength side of the story has been inadequately explicated and laid out. So here, institutions are not weak, they're strong. Particularly, state apparatus is strong. Ruling parties are strong. The military is cohesive, right? There's no real sign of real divide within the regime. The rulers are relatively unified, okay? They can pursue this, and in the case we look at, they do pursue this not as some last resort, but as a proactive strategy. Again, looking down the game tree, if you will, and saying if we pursue these democratic reforms, it could solve some problems for us. Okay? It doesn't take the form of an exit from office, but rather, and it's not negotiated. There's no big roundtable process, but instead what you have is just a unilateral leveling of the playing field. That the regime says we're basically going to release political prisoners, we're going to allow the press more freedom, we're going to allow opposite political parties to form, things like this. And this is, if you're familiar with this literature on pacts, right? There was all this idea driven from like the Spanish case in particular that democracy requires a pact. You know, the sensible people in government and the sensible people in opposition have to get together and say, okay, let's talk this through. Let's come up with a pact, and we'll protect your interests, and everyone will be safe, right? And I recently, I don't want to call anybody out, but I recently got a message from a Spanish economist who said it's totally what you're talking about. There was no pact. There was no negotiation. The regime just said we're going to do these things. And years down the road, they had some negotiations about the terms. But basically, this is something an authoritarian regime starts on their own. They don't need to sit down and hammer it out and come to some kind of agreement on how to democratize. Authoritarian regimes do it on their own time, through their own and on their own terms. And in fact, one of the major reasons why we argue it's strategic for authoritarian regimes to consider doing this is precisely because the stronger you are, the more you can control the process. Okay, the more you're able to define what the rules are going to be, what the timing is going to be, right? Rather than waiting until things start falling apart. Okay, so unilateral leveling playing. Okay, critically here, you don't concede defeat, you concede democracy. Okay. So again, every time people talk about could China democratize, the question is, okay, well, why would the CCP ever give up power, right? And we're just saying, don't think about it that way. The CCP would not have to give up power to democratize. They would have to do what the KMT did in Taiwan, which is hold multi-party elections, which they could win. Okay, so they're different questions. Exiting power and democratization are not the same thing. But I assure you, whenever you read about this paper, people will pay this basic categorical error. Okay, trying to get people passed. Okay, so in these scenarios, it's not that dictators are bundling their experiments. Okay, and so one reason they can do this is again, they're in a pretty strong position, and they feel as if, well, if it doesn't go the way we expect it to go, I mean, it's politics. No one knows exactly how it's going to go. There's not full prescience. This is not intelligent design. It's a reversible experiment. Okay, so regimes embark on these liberalization agendas, right? Which, again, the Crete example should give you a sense. It can culminate in full democracy. It doesn't have to end in this kind of halfway house of a partially liberalized regime. Okay, so it's very much an experiment. Critically here, it is not. So as a matter of psychology, right? It's not the threat of revolution, but it's the expectations of stability that drive regimes to do this. Okay, so if you fear being overthrown in a violent revolution, probably your first instinct is I should open up the process for it, right? It's really a great time to democratize, right? I think what we see in most places, we think about Syria under Assad, right? Think about how the Burmese military behaved every single time that massive students or monastic protests would grow. They just would open fire, right? They're not going to loosen up in a moment like that. They're only going to loosen up in a moment when they're convinced that it's not going to go out of hand. Okay, and so far from being quite the opposite of it being some kind of terrifying revolutionary threat that prompts democratization and democratic reform, it's precisely the expectation that there could be stability after these reforms. That's why. Excuse me. So again, these scenarios, the legitimacy of the regime is not fully relinquished, but gets redefined. So again, these are regimes with decades of history of again, it varies. Places like Myanmar, Cambodia, the least, but still some history of having produced pretty serious economic transformation. And so basically, it's trying to leverage that legitimacy from the performance legitimacy from economic performance and try to leverage it into democratic success to then become a popular political party and to be able to win elections. Or in the case of militaries, that they're party proxies to win elections. It's not a sudden collapse. These can be sequential concessions. Again, so the regime can do this on its own terms, its own timing. So it can basically lay out one concession at a time and basically do this very gradually. So it looks quite different. So in a case like Taiwan, people could argue, Taiwan experts argue all the time, when did Taiwan become a democracy? Like when in this long string of concessions, right? And the whole point is it doesn't even matter, right? Because the whole idea is because it's done so gradually that if there's not one critical moment, it's not some sort of sudden shift. And you get a lot of elite continuity, again, as captured in the Note UFO, right? A lot of people who are in the old regime stay in power. A lot of people who oppose the old regime stay out of power. But the regime governs in a fundamentally different way. So this should hopefully give you a sense of just kind of what's up theoretically here. And for those of you with interest in such things, we have on the right here a bunch of works that we think kind of come closest to what we're saying here. So you might say, haven't heard this before. This is something we already know. I think that what this set of really fantastic theories that we have do, it gets to the point where you say, okay, an authoritarian regime might preemptively liberalize when it's like, when it's so much competition, but not go all the way to democracy. and they might exit entirely, but they don't see them staying in power. If democracy means you exit power, okay, and I think we're different here in like emphasizing and finding some really concrete cases of democracy did not mean an exit from power for old authoritarian elites. Okay, so that's kind of the theory. So the region, the theory. So why would this happen? How does this connect to the questions of economic development? And the book really is about half of the book is about economic development. So if you're interested in that, we talk in pretty great detail about what economic development has looked like in these different clusters in these different cases. So why would this kind of lead to this possibility? And to put it in really basic terms, what we argue is that economic development, again, especially if it's been over decades, he's really had this transformation from a relatively poor country to a high income or middle income country, that you develop a track record. And that the political authorities who have overseen this economic transformation have a track record they can leverage for what we call victory confidence. Okay, and really, probably the heart of the book is these ideas of victory confidence and stability confidence. Okay, victory confidence, and hopefully it's very intuitive what we mean by these terms. Victory confidence is simply the confidence of these old authoritarian elites that they could fare well in actually free, fair, competitive democratic elections. Victory confidence. Besides the track record, which they can run on economic development also, particularly in Northeast Asia, but really throughout this region, did lead to substantial poverty reduction. To the extent that is true, that should give the regime more stability confidence. Stability confidence, again, is just, again, the old regime's elites, their confidence that even if you democratize the political system, it's not going to lead to instability. It's not going to lead to, in the case of poverty reduction, it's not going to lead to like massive redistributive payments. The poor are not going to completely try to soak the rich. So to the degree that you've read work, again, Anthony Carlos, Logan Robinson, and Carl Squash's work, this is I do think one thing that makes wealthy elites scared of democracy is the fear of expropriation, fear of redistributive taxation. So it lessens that kind of fear. So it's although it comes from strength, it's really at the heart of the matter is, do authoritarian elites have victory confidence and stability confidence? If they don't, there's no way you're going to get democracy through strength. They have to have this victory confidence and stability confidence at the heart of this. Okay. So then you're strong, you're confident, but why would you do it? Why not just stay put? Why not just keep going? If you're an authoritarian regime in a strong position, you don't have to do this. Okay? You can just keep being authoritarian. So the argument we make is that, and this is something we said back in 2013, but so this part of the theory is pretty similar to the book. That's what we argued in this article, Perspectives on Politics, back in 2013. We basically said that there's three parts. There are strengths, and then there's signals, and there are strategies. Okay, so I've been talking about strengths, but let me say a little bit more about this. Okay, so let me say just briefly that the idea here, and hopefully this will be clear as I lay out the patterns and cases in a little bit more depth. It's basically the case that the regimes that are the strongest sometimes pursue these reforms and sometimes don't. So it's not a matter of just the stronger the regime gets, the more likely this becomes. Okay, because we have this heterogeneity across even the strongest regimes. Okay, so we need to think in terms of spectrums. So there's a real variation in how strong these regimes are, what kind of economic track record they have. So the six democratic or concession cases we look at, and you can see if you remember the clusters, these are really, you can sort of see these are exactly the four clusters. So Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, timing 50s, 80s, 90s, and the 80s. And this is the development status cluster, development militarist cluster, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, all weaker on the spectrum of strength, but democratized later on. Thailand and Myanmar was reversed. And then the sixth authoritarian, or we call it democracy avoidance cases, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, China, Vietnam, Cambodia. So again, you can see the clusters kind of popping off the screen a little bit here about the ways in which what cluster you're in is going to be the best predictor of whether you pursue these democratic reforms or not. So let's talk through a little bit of the just a few examples here, or just kind of give you a sense of the pattern and how to think about this. So if it were the case that the two top clusters that we see here, right, that again, these are the richest, the strongest institutions, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong. If these were the six cases that had all pursued democratic reforms of the kind I'm talking about, then basically modernization theory looks great. Okay, so okay, well, that's why. But it doesn't. In fact, it's vertical variation. So the 6 that pursue these reforms are the statist cluster and the militarist cluster. So one of the more intermediate strength clusters. So it's simply, so you get kind of remarkably, I think there's kind of a threshold here, and most authoritarian regimes in the world, I think, are weaker than these. Don't have the kind of state capacity, economic growth record in these cases, right? That it's cases that really run the gamut from kind of as barely strong as Myanmar was in the early 2010s to as strong as a regime as like Taiwan in the 1980s and 90s that will pursue these reforms. So it's a lot of variation. By the same token, it basically mirrors the strengths of the regimes that have not. So you can run the gamut again from Singapore to a Cambodia. Very, very strong institutions, very, very impressive economic track record, very high income. But yet you've had democracy avoidance across all of these 6 cases as well. So hopefully what this suggests is it's something about the clustering. Okay, it's not just like about how high or low you are on the spectrum of strength that explains whether you're going to pursue these reforms. But what your altitude, if you will, what it does, I think, explain quite well is if an authoritarian regime pursues these democratic reforms, okay, how well is it likely to fare under democracy? Okay, and so here I think that again, these kinds of regimes have all built up strengths under authoritarianism that can translate into democratic competition. So in a place like Singapore with the PAP, I think the PAP could remove every remaining lingering authoritarian law it has on the books, and it would then again win probably even a bigger majority in the next elections than the last one. I don't think that's a controversial claim, or I don't think there's even a lot of unpredictability about that. So the higher up you are, the less unpredictability. The lower you are, weaker institutions, you have less information, and you're more likely to have a reversible transition. So this is, I think, helps make sense of why Thailand has seen the military come back, why Myanmar has seen the military come back. Indonesia, which has the strongest civilian institutions, strongest state, strongest ruling party of those 3 cases. Indonesia has been the one where democracy has, at least so far, survived. And then the last thing I'll note about these cases, again, is that, again, you might think, well, this is just, why would you ever take the risk as an authoritarian regime? Why do these reforms? Why not just keep the status quo? And the argument we make is that, in fact, that the strengths that you have can be fleeting. Okay? And that trying to just maintain the authoritarian status quo, particularly in a region of such rapid economic development and sort of wrenching social change, like there is no status quo. And that if you don't pursue these reforms when you're in a strong position, you might not be in a strong position to do them for very long. And so even just over the course of this book, hard to believe, but 3 of the 12 cases have kind of, we would argue, have in fact brought to pass exactly what we were sort of warning when we started working on the book. That in Malaysia, where they absolutely easily could have fully democratic elections in 1999 and won in a landslide, but for basically for 20 years, they avoided these reforms and eventually just got voted out. Again, Hong Kong, again, a place where there was a lot of electoral support for conservatives who had perfectly good relations with Beijing, but they held off for so long and would not reform the security laws, and they would not reform the electoral system to actually open up the system, and they wind up with the umbrella revolution, right? Or in Cambodia, where in the first decade of the 2000s, the economy was doing pretty well. Repression was not all that extreme. It seemed like Hun Sen's party could actually win free and fair elections if they would have held them, but they didn't. They waited too long, and again, they start plummeting in popularity. And so, in all 3 of these cases, they've lost the capacity to have the kind of stabilizing democratic transition, in which you stay in power and remain, a strong ruling party under democratic conditions, like you had in particularly Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So there is a real risk, I think, and we have 3, I think, very concrete examples of there being a real risk to waiting too long and not actually trying to pursue reforms when you're in a position to thrive. So to conclude, just a few points to try to wrap the book with. One is, so you might be familiar with these arguments that this part of the world is uniquely ill-suited for democratization. These are often culturalist accounts that focus on Confucianism or focus on Asian values, or they get these ideas that like this is just not a part of the world where democracy should thrive. But we argue if you take an institutional approach rather than a cultural approach, this is actually a region that is distinctly well suited for democracy through strength, precisely because you have these decades of economic growth, strong states, strong ruling parties that are able to then compete in democracy. Okay. Asia's modal democratization path, we stress, is actually maybe more comparable to some older European cases than to similarly young democracies. So we might think it makes sense to compare democracies that arose in a similar time period. In fact, in particular, if you read Daniel Ziblatt's work on Europe, and we co-authored an article about this, that this idea that conservative parties can be can ironically be actually the sort of the forebears of democratic reforms because of their confidence that they can survive in a democracy. So there's, I think, some interesting parallels there. But also stress here that when we study authoritarianism, tend to be very focused on the question of collapse. When's the regime going to collapse? When's the regime going to collapse? And I think we should be thinking a lot more about how the institutions of these regimes, the policies they pursue, their developmental track records, they shape. First of all, they shape just the face and the basically the living conditions of the people who live under these regimes. So it's very important. But it also shapes the long-term potential for them to have a stabilizing or a destabilizing concession process. Okay? So looking ahead, you can sort of see in authoritarian regimes that are building strong institutions, that are developing a strong economic track record, the potential is there for these democracy scenarios. So they're moving further from collapse, but they might be moving closer to democracy in some circumstances. I think one reason this matters for our current moment is because this democratic recession we're in, democratic backsliding, I think a lot of it hinges on a lack of confidence that democracy and stability can go together. So if you don't think democracy can provide stability, you're not going to be a Democrat for very long, despite what people say about their democratic values. And again, so to kind of conclude, that kind of points to the fact that, as I said at the outset, democracy is a universal value. We don't think there's anything particularly Western about democracy or Eastern about democracy or anything. There's no cardinal direction that goes with democracy. But because democracy is not the ultimate in politics, people care more about things like avoiding civil war. They care more about avoiding abject poverty, right? So either democratic politics is able to help fulfill these deeper needs for stability, peace, prosperity, whereas democracy is going to remain forever and everywhere in danger. And it doesn't matter if you've been in democracy for 100 years, or 200 years, or 5 years. It's not really secure anywhere if it can't solve these kinds of problems. And so, east or west, I think the same lessons apply. Okay, so that's kind of a broad brushstrokes review of what's in the book. And so I'm very eager for questions and any reactions. Oh, sure.
Wait, you got two nails first.
Yes, I did.
Go.
Turn the microphone.
Yep. All right. I'll go. Hi, Jacob Drashina, HK student. I'm wondering about, you mentioned that whenever you switch from authoritarian to democracy, the stronger it is. Sometimes there's these inflection points, these junctures to where signs that authoritarians look for to say, okay, we could perhaps democratize a little bit. So I'm curious, in these case studies, what are the specific signs, polling? I mean, what are the key things that people look at to say, okay, we're ready to now go to the next step? Thank you.
Yeah. So this is kind of the signals. And so there's sort of four types of signals that we emphasize here. So one is an electoral signal. So if you're again places like Singapore is a really good example where each election they can kind of thermostatically see are we doing a little better, are we doing a little bit worse. So it's kind of a clear signal of what the support is like. And then contentious signals we argue the strongest signal. So massive protests. So we see protests. That's I think the strongest signal the regime can receive. And then economic and geopolitical signals as well. So, and these seem to matter most for particular clusters. So geopolitical signals. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Japan, Taiwan, South Korea are all American allies. Okay. Certainly the withdrawal of recognition of the Republic of China, I think was played a very big role. I think that South Korea is concerned about its image and on the verge of the Olympics. These things I think do really matter. The geopolitical side can matter, especially in that cluster. And then the economic side of things, think about Indonesia and the economic crisis Indonesia had. Very, very powerful signal that the old authoritarian way of doing things was not up to the task. And then so what we sort of say more theoretically there, what these signals do. So what they should do, they have to kind of there's sort of this mix of ominous signals and reassuring signals. Okay. So what the signal should do, and there's no very, very simple story of how this happens, but on the one hand, your strong regime being some kind of ominous signal that you've passed your apex of authoritarian power, right? You're not just in cruise control anymore. There's rising challenges, but also some kind of reassuring signals that you have enough strength to thrive under democracy. And this is what we call this bittersweet spot. So it's a sweet spot because again, if you do it now, you can still win. You wait too long, you're gonna miss the sweet spot, but it's bitter because you're getting some bad news. Like maybe you're not as popular as you used to be. And I don't think there's a lot of examples of regimes, authoritarian regimes, like really losing a lot of popularity and support and then regaining it. I think especially in contexts where there's been rapid economic development, the middle class is growing. Generally, they just keep tending to generate more and more opposition over time. So it doesn't tend to get better. At one point, I should stress there is we tend to look at a regime and say, oh, well, there's protests. So think about China recently, okay, when these protests, erupted over COVID, and so people say, oh, well, the regime is weakening. Say, no. The regime is strong, but it's under increased pressure. Okay, so these are totally different things. So exactly the kind of things you're looking at, these signals, these pressures as they arise, they are not signs of regime weakness. What they're signs of is what a strong or weak regime has to deal with. So regime strength, as we think about it, builds up over a long period of time, and pressures, signals, these things can arise they can erupt very suddenly. But distinguishing them, I think, is really important. So
It's just a ridiculous question on what's absolutely. Yes.
Thanks, Dan. This is a great project. And this slide was actually very clarifying for me. But I'm very taken by your point, which 2 points. The first, which is that many of these democratic reforms do not come about as a result of some kind of pact. The regime just does it. Certainly that my experience in the Middle East, like if you look at, Mubarak liberalizing a little bit, that was just something he did in response to some pressures that he was getting from the US. The second thing that you say that I really found very appealing is this idea that conceding democratization does not mean conceding power.
Right.
I think that's a very important point. So here's the question. Let's imagine Singapore, PAP decides to concede democratization.
Yeah.
How do I, as a social scientist, all I can observe is that they just keep winning? How do I know that the country's democratized?
Right. So this is kind of whole debate. Like, do you only know democracy because there's been a transfer of power? Let's just take a couple of time, right? Let's be quick.
That's fine.
So I'll try to be quick. So basically, it is about the level. Okay, it's about making the legal changes, but they say you're now on a level playing field. Substantially more so than in the past. So those kinds of things, and that's I think very clear. So you keep winning, but if you're winning fair and square, political prisons are open, press is freer, the opposition party allowed to run. That's the key.
I'm in one right here.
Yeah, thank you.
Gender diversity in the questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I just want to make sure that I got the argument right. So if I may restate what I got, so if I understand you correctly, the countries that you think have moved from development to democracy are really 3 cases out of the 12. And then in terms of the others, are you saying that you think that the trend that the other cases will follow through? Or what are you saying is really more like an advice to these regimes that maybe this is the route that you should take so that you do democracy from strength? So are you predicting or are you advising, if I may put it this way?
Right. Are you a Fulbright Fellow at Carr Center for Human Rights Policy? I have 2 things. One is just a question. Why is Philippines not here? Because you started with Marcos, and I think the Philippines also the democracy has developed quite unique in some ways. And also the other one is that recently there has been some studies on the illiberal democracy. So I was just wondering, in the democracy through strength, where you also recognized the illiberal practices of democracy. Thank you.
I'll take the option, but take 2 is okay? Yes. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I have a question about Singapore. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the Singapore case? I think it's fascinating. And where do you see Singapore going, right? Because it
Yeah.
feels like, it's the perfect country to become a full democracy. And so
Yeah.
how do you see this happen?
Yeah, well, because this connects a little bit here. So I guess I'll start with this illiberal democracy. So one thing we kind of should try to lay out in introduction, say, democracy, it's kind of back to Tara's question in a way. So democracy requires, that the government allow itself to compete against opposition parties, and that it accepts electoral results when they don't go its way. And it requires that they give its opponents the space to actually be able to generate support through association and media and things like this. So there's a whole set of liberties that democracy, even minimal democracy requires. It's more than just elections, right? But it is also true, and I write that into these, I talk about this a lot. Some of these democracies then do some very liberal things. Okay, and it doesn't mean those things also matter, but it's not the kind of democratization we're talking about here. So it's a little bit of a side question. I think the kind of reforms that, again, do allow a level playing field are incredibly important. I mean, releasing political prisoners is very, very important. Allowing, open, discussion in the public sphere about challenging the regime is very, very, very important. So I think what we're talking about is very, very important, but it's not everything. And the problems of democracies taking illiberal turns is something else I work on a great deal, but it's not in this book. So, but happy to talk about. So kind of on Singapore, and then sort of what's next, predicting, advising, and the like. So first of all, like strong autocrats are very unpredictable. Okay. So if you have that much power and that much discretion, like any regime could stay, they want to stay in power, they do. Okay. So it's not something where you predict they're going to. I certainly would never say I predict that authoritarian regimes are going to pursue these democratic reforms. What I will say is that I think they become more likely in certain conditions. And the kind of signals I talked about, that under conditions of these kind of four types of signals we talk about, it becomes more likely that a regime will do this. And I think they're more likely to do it actually if they're pretty confident than if they're not. Okay, so those are the things that I would say. So I think if the PAP does 2% better in the next election or 2% worse, they're more likely to pursue these reforms than they do 2% worse. So that's sort of where we're. And the other thing that I would say, or as a prediction, is if Singapore does it, or if Malaysia had done it when they were at their peak of strength, they would have thrived and done very, very well in democratic elections. I'm very comfortable asserting that. I see no reason why that would not be the case. And the lower you are, the rockier road you're going to have. So at this point, what we have is there are still three what we call candidate cases, right? So Singapore, China, Vietnam. These are all cases that we argue are still strong enough to do this. They haven't gone through their bittersweet spot. All of them could pursue democratic reforms and thrive. And what I would say as sort of a prescription is that, yes, it is almost certainly true that the earlier you do it, the better it's likely to go. The smoother it is likely to go. But over time, you're more likely to start becoming more like Cambodia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, where over time you become weaker, you get less control over the process. So yes, it is sort of a prescription that, again, waiting until you're stronger and more popular and people start loving you again is not doesn't seem to be the winning formula.
Yeah, I'll ask you a question, Dan. Then. My question is basically about how you classify these different countries, right? So when I think about Vietnam is still a poor country. It has a long way to go before it matches the development record of a country like Japan or Taiwan or South Korea. So why would you say that it's a strong regime? So how are you defining strength? And then the second question I had was about developmental Britannia, which is, I think of British institutions, parliamentary democracy and the like, which all of these countries have. Now, Hong Kong, of course, is an exception now because I'm not sure if it should even really be in this classification, because obviously it's under communist control, effectively.
Right.
But as far as Singapore and Malaysia are concerned, what is it about this inheritance that makes them less likely to democratize at the same level of income and progress against poverty?
Hi, my question is more around like implication of your book for regarding like foreign policy from the U.S. side, because a lot of the foreign policy from the U.S. is like you need to democratize first before we'll engage with you. For example, in Myanmar case, they've refused to deal with the U.S. The military from Myanmar for a while. But in your book, it seems like you almost like the geopolitics is one of the big equations of the signals that you're talking about. So I'm wondering whether this changes the perspective around what comes first, democracy or development, and whether that has implication in terms of foreign policy that US or any developed countries need to consider when dealing with these kind of categories of countries.
Yeah. Great questions, both of you. So in terms of the foreign policy, so we do kind of address the whole sequencing debate in the conclusion. So I think one way you could read our book is to say, don't try democracy until you develop to a certain point and built up the kind of strengths that Colin was asking about, which really are about, again, strong state institutions, strong party institutions, strong economic track record. And again, I think Vietnam, if you compare Vietnam to most countries in the developing world, its record over the past 30 years, it's grown substantially, right, and become a substantially wealthier country than it was 30 years ago. So think of it from a global perspective. I think I do think Vietnam is again intermediate strength. I'm going to overstate it. I'm going to equate it with the spectrum. Really matters. It matters a lot that there's variation, like the vertical variation here. But I do think they're all candidate cases that you do. I don't expect, again, I think the CCP would do better than the VCP. I think that they would be, so take your point, but I do think there's some, I think we could pretend we could measure the threshold, but I don't think it's really, I don't think it's easy to precisely pin down where that threshold is. And so in terms of what is it about Britannia? I think that in these cases, there are a few things going on. I think one is just the I think the first past the post electoral rules. I think it allows political parties to become much more dominant. So that kind of malapportionment. So cases like again whether the BN and unknown Malaysia or the PAP, they win big, but they win these insane seat majorities, way bigger than their vote majorities. So it's helped them consolidate power for sure.
Shouldn't that make them more likely to concede because they've got an electoral system that's in their
well, again, it gives them the strength, but not the signals, right? So that you're a far cry from even there's no prospect of electoral defeat. So any kind of like how long would it take for the opposition to actually defeat us? It's so far in the distance that again the signal very weak electoral signals of incipient decline. Yes. So I suspect that a lot of what is involved here is, so it is, again, these are multi-party systems. So you say, well, we're elected, right? And so there's I think that alleviates some of the pressure to actually to produce the actual freedoms that are required for actually fully functional democracy, right? So I think that alleviates somewhat. I also think the strength of judicial institutions and legal institutions, right? It provides another way in which you can govern in a way that it's, again, I think Singaporeans, Hong Kongers for sure. I don't know if anyone here has spent time in Hong Kong, but obsessed with rule of law. Like it's so absolutely vital that rule of law be protected, to Hong Kongers, these critics of the CCP, right? It's really, so this kind of, I think again, I think what that does is it for many people can give you a little bit of a surrogate for, again. So again, it seems like there are rights. There are elections that are rights, and yeah, they're not perfect, but you can kind of say, well, we're imperfect, but I think it does give you some rhetorical devices for avoiding deeper reform. And then in terms of foreign policy, yeah, I think the main thing I would say is that we have to treat authoritarian regimes differently. They're not all the same. The obvious comment, perhaps, but when you say let's have a democracy summit and the democracies get to come and everybody else doesn't get to come, kind of not really distinguishing. I guess I think that any authoritarian regime in the world that is building stronger institutions, that is actually committed to rising living standards, actually seems to want to make life better for its people in general, right? You engage with, right? And you basically try to say, well, there are ways in which, and try to make sure people realize that when they say democracy, we're not saying we want you to collapse. We want you to be overthrown. We want you to be, we want your political demise, right? And if you don't talk in a more sensible way about what democracy means, just if you're so great and you think you're so great, then compete. Just stop locking them all up, And so I think we really have to distinguish a Myanmar from from a Singapore, right? I think it's just so fundamentally different. And I think we should be where we're looking for democratic prospects, rather than saying, look for the weakest, like that'll take the hindmost, look for the weakest regimes out there. Ooh, they're close to democracy. Think about some of the strongest ones and say, no, you know what? Just look at these other examples. Like if you don't have to, it's not doing you any favors. And in fact, another big part of this is generally these authoritarian controls generate more opposition and more unified opposition. Because your opponents, they're all these crazy people of all kinds, all walks of life, and they're all opposing the regime because they don't like the regime, right? But if you democratize, this is what happened in South Korea, it's what happened in Indonesia. These very diverse aspects of the opposition, they fragment. Because then, like, well, we don't have these authoritarian controls unifying us anymore. So it's actually a very savvy, and proved to be a very savvy device to try to make sure your opponents weren't too strong. So there's all these kinds of ways, I think, just sort of the nudging, the advising, and looking for democratic potential in places that I think we currently think it's very far away. Maybe it's not, including I think at least in terms of potential of China. And I think again, China might get closer to democracy over the next decade. It has a good decade and it has a bad decade. Okay. So I think that's a different way of thinking about the situation.
Okay, great. So I think we're out of time. But on that prescriptive note, how appropriate for the guidance school, we'll close and thank Professor Slater.